The truth about female attraction is not what most men have been taught, and that is exactly where the confusion begins. When we talk about attraction, we are not just talking about appearance, money, or confidence alone, but about a deeper psychological response that often operates silently beneath the surface of awareness. Welcome to the channel, where we break down real relationship dynamics in a way that is simple, human, and based on patterns seen in real emotional behavior. In my years of observing conversations between men and women, one thing has remained consistent. Attraction is rarely logical, and it does not always follow the rules people expect it to follow. That is where most misunderstandings begin. Many men assume attraction is something that can be forced, earned instantly, or secured through effort alone. But in reality, attraction responds more to how a man carries his emotional presence than what he does to impress. What makes this topic controversial is that it challenges the common belief that being overly available, overly nice, or constantly proving value is the path to being desired. I have seen situations where the more a man tries to gain approval, the more distance he unintentionally creates, not because he lacks worth, but because the emotional balance shifts in the interaction. Attraction often grows in space, uncertainty, and self-direction, not in pressure or pursuit. And once you understand this, you start to see relationships differently, not as something to chase, but something that develops naturally when the emotional dynamics are aligned correctly. And once you see it clearly, it becomes impossible to ignore. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's dive in. 1. Why attraction is more emotional than logical. When we talk about attraction, especially in real human relationships, one of the biggest misunderstandings is assuming that people choose who they are drawn to based on logic, as if it is a checklist of qualities being measured and compared. In reality, attraction often begins in a place that is far less rational and far more emotional, almost automatic in how it forms. In my experience observing relationship patterns over the years, both in real-life interactions and in guided conversations, I have noticed that people rarely fall for what makes sense on paper. Instead, they respond to how someone makes them feel in their presence. There have been situations where a man may have all the so-called right qualities, stability, kindness, good intentions, yet still struggle to create a strong emotional pull, not because those qualities are unimportant, but because they do not automatically translate into emotional stimulation. On the other side, I have seen cases where someone with fewer obvious advantages still creates a strong sense of interest simply through the emotional experience they bring into interactions. This is because attraction is deeply tied to emotion first, and only later does the mind begin to justify it with logic. The mind looks for reasons after the feeling has already been established. In a therapeutic sense, I often explain this as the difference between understanding something intellectually and actually feeling it in your body. You can understand that someone is a good match for you, but still not feel drawn to them. And you can feel drawn to someone without fully understanding why at first. This is where many people get confused and start overthinking their approach to relationships. They focus so much on presenting the right image that they forget the emotional tone they are actually creating in real time. Attraction responds more to presence, emotional energy, and subtle psychological signals than to explanations or effort. And once you begin to understand this, you start to see why some connections feel natural and effortless, while others feel forced, even when everything looks right on the surface. 2. The role of space in emotional mystery and desire. One of the most misunderstood elements of attraction is the role that space plays in building emotional interest. Many men assume that the closer they stay, the faster attraction will grow. But in practice, it often works in the opposite direction. In my experience observing relationship dynamics, I have seen that desire does not grow in constant presence. It grows in the gaps between presence. When everything is fully available, fully explained, and fully predictable, the emotional mind has very little left to explore, and exploration is a key part of how attraction develops. Space creates curiosity, and curiosity is one of the strongest emotional drivers in human behavior. I have seen situations where a man becomes deeply focused on maintaining constant contact, replying instantly, always being available, always explaining himself, thinking this will increase closeness. But what actually happens is that the emotional tension slowly dissolves. Without tension, there is no anticipation, and without anticipation, attraction begins to flatten. This does not mean distance is about playing games or being unavailable in a manipulative way. It is about understanding that emotional connection needs breathing room to stay alive. In therapeutic conversations, I often explain that people do not bond deeply with what they can fully predict. They bond with what still has layers to discover. Emotional mystery is not about hiding who you are. It is about not revealing everything at once, allowing your presence to be experienced over time rather than all at once. When a man has his own direction, his own rhythm, and does not revolve his entire emotional state around immediate responses or constant reassurance, it naturally creates a different kind of energy in the interaction. The other person begins to think about him more, not because he is doing more, but because there is space for thought to exist. Attraction needs room to breathe, and when that space is respected, emotional interest tends to deepen rather than fade. 3. Why overavailability lowers perceived value. Overavailability is one of the fastest ways attraction quietly weakens, even when intentions are good. In many conversations I have observed over time, I've noticed a pattern where a man begins by being attentive, consistent, and emotionally present, but slowly shifts into a pattern where he is always reachable, always responding instantly, always adjusting his time and energy around the other person. At first, this may feel like care and dedication, but psychologically, it often changes how he is perceived in the dynamic. When something is always available, the mind stops treating it as something that requires anticipation or effort to engage with. This is not about playing hard to get, but about how human psychology naturally assigns value to things that feel balanced with effort and space. I have seen cases where a man unintentionally reduces his own perceived value, not because of who he is, but because there is no longer any emotional contrast in how he shows up. Everything becomes predictable, immediate, and accessible, and over time, predictability can reduce emotional intensity. In therapeutic discussions, I often explain that attraction thrives on a healthy balance between presence and independence. When a man's availability becomes the center of his behavior, the emotional weight of his presence begins to shift. Instead of being someone whose attention feels meaningful when given, he becomes someone whose attention is expected at all times, and expectation is very different from appreciation. Another important aspect is emotional self-direction. When a person is constantly adjusting their schedule, mood, or priorities to maintain continuous contact, it can unconsciously signal a lack of boundaries, even if no words are spoken about it. Healthy attraction is often supported by a sense that both individuals have full lives outside of each other, not one orbiting entirely around the other. I have also noticed that when a man pulls back from over-engagement and returns to a more grounded, intentional level of interaction, the emotional response from the other person often changes, not because manipulation is involved, but because balance is restored. Attraction is not built on constant access. It is built on meaningful moments of connection that are felt, not overused. 4. How women respond to emotional leadership, not pressure. In many relationships I have observed, one pattern becomes very clear over time. Emotional pressure tends to create resistance, while emotional leadership tends to create trust. There was a situation I once reflected on involving a couple I worked with in a general counseling setting, where the man constantly tried to secure reassurance through questions, explanations, and emotional intensity whenever he felt uncertain. He believed that the more he expressed his fears, the more closeness he would create. But what actually happened was the opposite. The more he pushed for emotional clarity in moments of tension, the more withdrawn his partner became, not because she did not care, but because the emotional environment started to feel heavy, unpredictable, and pressured. Emotional leadership, on the other hand, is not about dominance or control. It is about stability. It is the ability to remain grounded when emotions fluctuate, without forcing immediate resolution or validation. In relationships where emotional leadership is present, one person does not collapse into anxiety or urgency when things feel uncertain. They maintain direction and calm presence. I have seen how this changes the entire tone of a relationship. In another case I observed, a man learned to stop reacting instantly to every emotional shift in the relationship and instead allowed space for things to settle naturally before responding. This did not mean he became distant or cold. It meant he stopped trying to fix every emotional moment immediately. Over time, his partner began to feel more emotionally secure, not because he gave more explanations, but because he stopped adding pressure to every interaction. Emotional leadership creates a sense of safety, and safety is a key foundation of attraction that is often overlooked. When a woman feels that a man is not easily thrown off balance, not easily reactive, and not dependent on constant emotional reassurance, she begins to relate to him differently. Not from a place of managing his emotions, but from a place of experiencing him as steady. Pressure creates tension in relationships, but leadership creates direction, and direction is what allows emotional connection to grow without feeling forced or fragile. 5. The shift from chasing to being chosen. In many relationships I have observed over time, there comes a point where the entire emotional dynamic either stabilizes or becomes strained, and that turning point is often shaped by whether a man is still operating from a chasing mindset or has shifted into a state of being chosen. I once reflected on a situation involving a couple in a long-term relationship, where the man was constantly trying to secure his place through effort, explanations, and emotional pursuit whenever he sensed distance. If his partner became quiet or less expressive, he would immediately step in, asking questions, trying to fix the mood, trying to restore connection as quickly as possible. At first, it looked like dedication, but over time it started to reshape the emotional balance between them. The relationship began to feel like it was always moving in one direction, with him doing most of the reaching and her responding rather than naturally engaging. What he did not realize was that constant pursuit removes the space where genuine attraction is allowed to breathe. There is no anticipation, no emotional pause, no moment for natural curiosity to build. I observed that when he eventually became more grounded and stopped reacting instantly to every shift in mood, the dynamic started to change. He did not become distant or uninterested. He simply stopped overcorrecting every emotional moment. He focused more on his own life, his own direction, and allowed the relationship to exist without constant intervention. At first, this created uncertainty because the pattern had changed, but over time, something important happened. His partner began to engage more willingly, not because she was being pressured, but because she now had the freedom to choose how she showed up. That is the key difference between chasing and being chosen. Chasing creates urgency, but urgency often replaces genuine emotional connection with pressure. Being chosen happens when your presence is valued without you constantly negotiating for it. In that space, attraction becomes more stable, more natural, and less forced, because it is no longer built on pursuit, but on mutual recognition and respect. In conclusion, female attraction is not as straightforward as many people assume, and it is rarely built on effort alone. It develops through emotional experience, balance, and the way two people interact over time. When a man understands the importance of space, emotional stability, and not over-chasing connection, the entire dynamic begins to shift naturally. Attraction is not something that can be forced into existence through pressure or constant availability. It is something that grows when both individuals feel free within the connection. Once you see this clearly, relationships stop feeling like pursuit and start becoming something more mutual, grounded, and real.